In order to really get to know something, you need to understand it from the inside out. To be an aircraft pilot or a sailor, you need to know the inner workings of every piece of your vehicle, to best understand how the vehicle works and to prevent accidents like engine failures, sinking, or somehow ending up in the Bermuda Triangle. The same can be said about a digital programmer needing an understanding of the rules that their coding software uses to be able to work with it, and give us smartphones, AI like ChatGPT, and the brain rot that is YouTube Kids. Or how a mathematician needs to know the incredibly complex set of rules and patterns seen in the numerical world in order to come up with concepts such as the Fibonacci sequence, the Pascal's triangle, all of which have shown up in the natural world in one shape or form, and even black holes 48 years before we even had the technology capable of making such an astronomical observation. To better understand life, one must also look inside at its inner workings. Whether this be by physically opening up the natural world through dissections, electron microscopy, or taking out ice cores, or by reading into the patterns that we see throughout all life, present and extinct. And it took our species, Homo sapiens, wise man, the smartest being of them all, as many egocentric people like to believe, over 300,000 years to begin to understand the driving force of nature. Evolution is a concept that carries more weight to it than most people give it credit for. Thanks to our current technological advances and our cumulative knowledge of it from over 160 years of the scientific method, we have been able to begin to unravel the patterns that we see in the natural world. And I want to show you some of these patterns in order for you to begin to see them in nature as well, to understand some of its inner workings. Look at this small mammal. What do you think it is more closely related to? A mink? A marten? Some strange rodent? Maybe a small otter? Believe it or not, these would not share a last common ancestor unless you trace back their parents, their parents' parents, their parents' parents' parents 18 million times. Mongooses, although having long slender bodies, proportionally short limbs, and are adapted to moving through tight spaces, all of which are features that it shares with minks and martens, are more closely related to the laughing, hypercarnivorous, pack-hunting, bone-crushing nightmares that we call hyenas, of all things. But how come mongooses and minks look so similar, even though mongooses are genetically closer to this or this? Or how come the body plans of mako sharks, dolphins, and the prehistoric reptiles that ruled the Jurassic oceans, known as ichthyosaurs, share such a resemblance to one another, all containing a dorsal fin, streamlined bodies, fins or flippers, and reduced or absent hind limbs? How come they look so unambiguously similar, even though the last time these three were related was when their grandparents looked like this guy, when life hadn't even developed a backbone and a mouth you could close? How come hummingbirds and the appropriately named hummingbird hawk moth fly, sound, feed, and even behave so uncannily similar to one another, participating in the exact same ecological niche in their environment as highly active nectarivores, or animals that live off of mainly nectar, completely independently of one another, when they were last related by their 315 millionth great grandfather well over 500 million years ago. Probably one of my favorite patterns in nature of them all, convergent evolution is a phenomenon that wasn't brought to light until Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859. But the term wasn't coined until a bit later. It is when two animals share very similar physical and/or behavioral characteristics with one another, even though their last common ancestor did not share those same adaptations. The reason why convergent evolution happens in the first place is because, in many ways, living organisms are the biological solutions to the environment that surrounds them. The reason why fish, cetaceans, and ichthyosaurs share so many characteristics is because through millions upon millions of generations, minute mutations at the molecular level slightly improved, worsened, or didn't do much to affect the chances that that specific individual's children will be able to have successful and sufficient children of their own. When the ancestors of whale sharks, beaked whales, or the 60-ton living room-sized reptile of Shastasaurus were set to survive in their oceanic world, or those of a goldfish and the, for lack of a better word, fish-shaped sea slugs of the genus Philiro, life ended up coming with similar solutions to the very relevant problem of moving through the viscous medium of water that they inhabited. Basing itself on the laws of hydrodynamics, how objects can move efficiently through the water, nature had found a very effective body plan for marine species, and so each lineage independently came up with extremely similar solutions to the same problem. And this pattern of seemingly unrelated lineages developing very similar structures is seen everywhere throughout nature, on greater and lesser scales. The wings of birds, bats, pterosaurs, fish, and insects having the right and similar proportions to be able to lift them into the sky. The structures of the cornea of cephalopods, such as squids, cuttlefish, and octopi, looking nearly indistinguishable to that of a human and almost all other vertebrates, even though cephalopods are closer to scallops than they are to us. Cases of convergent evolution are examples of designs that life creates that are just so effective that they essentially get copied into the genes of unrelated individuals, totally independently of one another. Evolution pushes for what works best in its environment, and in these cases, these body plans worked best for swimming in that specific part of the ocean or generating lift to bring their bodies off of the surface. As you can probably imagine, living things aren't only concerned with moving through the land, sky, or sea, and evolution does not only push animals to converge with similar body structures for locomotion. Life is just as much about the interactions that organisms have with one another than it is about overcoming the physical obstacles that our planet throws at us. And thanks to evolution, the interactions between life have been able to become unimaginably complex. One of the first and most important interactions between living beings is the arms race that has been running for the last 2 billion years that has shaped life as we know it today. Predation began in the simplest of ways. One simple cell engulfed the other in order to get its needed nutrients. At some point, around 1 billion years ago, evolution began to push certain populations to develop into multicellular but still comparatively simple life, which slowly gorged themselves on the mats of microbes that lived in the warm, shallow seas of the Ediacaran. But evolution was just getting warmed up. Clusters of light-detecting cells began to form into the earliest eyes, allowing animals to react to their surroundings. Improved nervous systems and muscle structures allowed them to move more rapidly, their primitive appendages becoming adapted for grabbing and their mouths for crushing prey. Some of the first apex predators that we know of were likely similar to the likes of this. Anomalocaris, meaning strange shrimp, though it is equally related to all spineless animals with an exoskeleton, from spiders to bees to crabs, Anomalocaris is argued to be one of the first active predators of its era, being much larger than the average animal at the time. After the emergence of these more advanced, active, and effective predators, the prey had to step up their own game. Through evolution, prey began to adapt to avoid being predated, evolving to swim away, armoring themselves, developing defensive behaviors, or simply growing spikes on their backs. These readaptations from the prey in turn put a selective pressure on the predators to develop new adaptations to overcome these challenges. These dynamics of prey evolving, predator adapting, and prey evolving once again have gone on continuously and are deeply integrated into the biosphere today. And after over 1 billion years of evolution making these interactions increasingly complex, we now end up with the webs of predators and prey alike that interact with one another, directly and indirectly, evolving to outperform their tasty meal or their hungry predator. Bats probably evolved from tree-climbing ancestors which may have glided from tree to tree, much like flying squirrels, snakes, and yes, there are snakes that can fly, you're welcome, and colugos, a strange distant cousin of yours. Some bats became adapted to eating fruits during the day, while others saw a new opportunity. Most birds didn't really remain active at night, and so the resources that the darkness provided were still untapped. One theory for why bats began to hunt at night is because they were following the butterflies of the darkness. As bats began to hunt moths, evolution gave them the ability to see with sound, much like whales and dolphins, in order to hunt their nocturnal prey. There was now a new selective pressure on the moths to find a way of avoiding their mammalian predators. And so, moths who were born with a slightly improved ability to hear the sonic screeches of bats, and thus their impending doom, fared a bit better than those who did not. And so, that feature was selected for by evolution. Eventually, moths evolved the ability to hear the ultra-high frequencies at which bats navigate in order to avoid them. That poses a new problem for the hungry bats. How can they catch their prey if they can hear them coming? If you hadn't already guessed, evolution obviously had a solution for that too. Just don't let the moths hear you. And so some species of bats developed the ability to navigate at even higher frequencies of sound, which moths had yet to evolve the ability to detect. But evolution plays no favorites. It pushed for the moths to adapt yet another way of avoiding becoming Bruce Banner's midnight snack. Some moths beat the bats at their own game. Using what can only be described as sonic weapons, ermine moths constantly emit 2 clicks for every time they beat their wings. And for the sensitive ears of a bat, this loud, annoying clicking is enough to deter them from getting close to the yummy moth. What I think is most amazing in this case is that these moths seem to be completely unaware of both the sounds that the bats and they produce. They don't even have hearing apparatus. Solely because of slight errors in the copying of genes, evolution has protected the oblivious moths from becoming Batman's dinner. Examples of this back and forth competition between species is seen literally everywhere in nature, even in your own bodies if you know where to look. There's many faces to evolution. It pushes for organisms to compete with one another, either by having them depend on the same resources, or to adapt against their respective predators or prey. The natural world can sometimes be portrayed as a cold, unforgiving, and solely competitive fight for survival. And although nature is most definitely competitive, I think it's not doing justice to its softer, more collaborative side. After all, in a world where it's only kill or be killed, nothing could really exist. The solutions that evolution comes up with aren't only to fuel competition between life or just to make sure that living things can move. It has pushed for collaboration and interdependence as much as it did for competition. Now I'm sure, or at least I really hope, that you have all heard about how flowers depend on pollinators. Flowering plants, or angiosperms, evolved sometime in the Mesozoic era, or the era of dinosaurs. And since then, many insects, birds, bats, and other species have developed a relationship with them in which they depend on those pollinators to sexually reproduce. The relationship between pollinators and flowering plants is a prime example of what is called coevolution, where two organisms are evolutionarily linked with one another. In some shape or form, we are all evolutionarily linked with what surrounds us. We evolved to depend on fruits, meats, and vegetables for our sustenance. Those same fruits evolved to depend on us to drop their seeds around, and even the animals we hunted depended on us and their other predators, on controlling their population so that they do not starve themselves. Some relationships in nature are more intimate, and thanks to evolution pushing this interdependence, we end up with some pretty amazing results. Now, this is an example of coevolution that is very unique in nature, and although it may not be as extreme as that of flowers and bees, it is still an interesting example of how evolution can bring two species together. Pleistocene Europe, 30,000 years ago. You lie behind a bush, addle-addle in your hand, your fingers numb and your nose runny from the cold, but the adrenaline keeps your senses heightened and your mind sharp. Your cousins, brother, and father-in-law are creeping up on the oblivious herd of reindeer grazing in the open steppe of Europe. A loud whistle signals the hunting party to throw their darts, directing them straight towards you. You've trained for this moment for months. Your first kill will mark the moment you stopped being a boy and became a man. You lunge out of the bush, your heart racing, your weapon tightly held. You launch your mammoth ivory spear with all your strength deep into the shoulder blade of the bigger male. It was a good shot. It won't run for much longer. After tracking the deer, following the trails of blood that tainted the white snow, butchering it, taking the most precious meats and the antlers as a trophy, you make the long hike home. The waiting family rejoice, your mother crying from her pride. Her little boy is now a man. It's been a pretty harsh winter, but you'll all go to sleep with a full belly tonight. As everyone else sleeps, you are picking up the scrapped organs and bits of tendons and skin that were left over, the flickering flame of the hearth holding on to its last bit of life. But in that dim light, the yellow eyes of another being look up at you, and then at the piece of stringy, chewy meat that you hold. Most of the time, wolves don't tend to get really close to us, since they too often make part of our food, or because we compete with them for the same hooved prey. But for some reason, this one in particular is less aggressive than the rest. You think to yourself, since nobody was gonna eat it anyway, you chuck that leftover at the canid. It smells it, looks up at you one final time before picking it up and walking away into the darkness. Sometime in the next few thousand years, these interactions between we strange apes and the wolf ancestors of dogs would develop into a friendship like never before. We survived just fine without them, and they did so too without us. But when we decided to work together, we began to change one another and depend on our relationship. Today, humans depend on dogs for protecting our properties, our houses, our sheep, our children. We use them to retrieve shot down ducks or track a wounded deer. We depend on them for emotional support, their naturally empathetic nature urging them to comfort someone in distress. They help those who are blind, paraplegic, or even diabetics and people prone to seizures. We grieve the death of dogs much like that of a loved one, and have done so for tens of thousands of years, burying them alongside our family members, tools and totems to help them in the afterlife, or even with a piece of mammoth bone gently placed in their mouth. Dogs have been deeply integrated into our families, and now we bring them everywhere we go. They benefited from the interactions with humans so much that they are now distinct from all other wolves. The shape of their faces being permanently changed in order to be able to express emotion more similarly and thus effectively to us, a form of interspecies communication. Your furry friend, who might be sat with you watching this video, is a piece of Ice Age history, an example of how evolution can form intimate bonds between two beings, and how many dogs depend on us, much like bees depend on flowers. This video ended up being a bit longer than I expected it to, but it is really important to understand the concepts behind evolution in order to get a deeper understanding of life. Evolution is just a driving force for organisms to change their bodies and behaviors as a solution to the challenges that their environment or interactions with other life throws at them. All life follows this principle, from viruses, naked mole rats, the potato-shaped Cotylorhynchus, and even you. It is the thread that links all life together and allows it to prosper. The concepts that I talked about today are just some of the patterns that nature holds, and if you'd like to know more of them, please let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, leave a like or subscribe to be up to date with my latest uploads. Until then, enjoy the outdoors, touch some grass, and love your parents.